During a Christmas dinner, I watched my son-in-law grab my daughter and throw her bodily into the wall. His father just smiled at that and said, "Good. That's how you teach someone who doesn't know their place." The rage in me burned white, but I kept my composure, helped my daughter to her feet, and placed a single phone call that set everything in motion. 15 minutes later, 12 black Rolls-Royces had surrounded the house, and everyone inside understood they had awakened someone they should never have crossed. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories, where the quiet ones always turn out to have the deepest roots. If stories like this one stay with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and give this a like. It genuinely helps more people find their way here. Before we begin, tell me in the comments what the weather is like where you are tonight. Something about settling in with a good story feels different depending on what's going on outside your window. One more thing, some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of telling it. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. Sasha says she'd love to see you. The message hadn't come from Sasha. It came through Dara Fletcher's assistant, a name I'd seen attached to 3 separate messages earlier that year, each one relaying something my daughter apparently needed me to know, but couldn't quite bring herself to say. I was at my workbench when it arrived, a carburetor. I'd been cleaning for the better part of an hour, still in my grip, grease deep in my knuckles, solvent sharp in the air. My mind went to the last time Sasha's actual voice had reached me through a phone line. Late August, a Sunday 4 months prior, 9 minutes total. I know that figure precisely because I checked it later. The same instinct that makes you press a wound to gauge how bad it is. She asked about my knee. I asked what had been filling her days. She told me she'd left her job, that she and Fletcher had concluded it was better for her to stay home. The words came out level, but hollow. Not grief exactly, more like what remains after grief has been held down long enough to calcify. I said it sounded like a significant change. She said it was fine. Then Fletcher's voice surfaced somewhere in the background, indistinct just enough to announce itself. Sasha said she had to go, said she'd call before long. That was 4 months back. She never called. My name is Warren Halcourt, 67 years old. I live quietly in a house on Copperleaf Road in Simsbury, Connecticut. A split-level colonial with a detached garage that claims more of my time than everything else on the property put together, which is exactly how I prefer it. My neighbors see a retired man who lifts a hand from the driveway, stays on top of his gutters, and sometimes has a light burning in the garage after 10 at night. The woman at the hardware store on Route 10 knows me by name and asks about my knee. Sasha used to do the same. I'm more grateful for it than I probably should be. But those neighbors don't know what that woman behind the counter doesn't know, what my son-in-law, Fletcher Morrow, has never once stopped to consider, is the life I lived for 31 years before I came here and started spending my evenings with carburetors and old wood and the particular silence that moves in once a man stops expecting to be understood. I set the carburetor aside, worked a shop rag over my hands, and gave the screen one last look. Then I turned to the car, a 2003 Mercury Grand Marquis, the color of faded charcoal, and made up my mind the way I always have, quietly, without consulting anyone. I would go to dinner. Glastonbury is 22 minutes on a clear night, less if you take the highway. I wanted the back roads. Room to think without rushing past the thinking. I'd been driving that 22-minute stretch for close to 2 years, and it had shown me things, the kind you only notice when you stop treating the destination as the point. I'd worked out that Sasha had stopped calling me directly, sometime around January. Every word since March had come filtered through Fletcher or someone on his payroll. And I knew what had happened to the birthday card I mailed in September, the one with a small watercolor of a covered bridge I'd painted myself, because she once told me covered bridges were her favorite. It came back 3 weeks later, return to sender scrawled across the front by someone else's hand. I told no one. There are things you hold by yourself, not because they don't matter, but because they haven't yet settled into something you can name, and trying to speak them too early only breaks them apart. The tires found their rhythm over slick pavement. Connecticut cold in December is a creature unto itself. Not the sharp, clarifying cold of January, something older, slower, pulling up from the ground and lodging behind your breastbone. It turns your thoughts toward warmth, a kitchen lit, from within a lamp, through a window, another person breathing the same air. Sasha grew up in cold like this. On nights like these, she used to lean against the car window and tell me the streetlights looked like dandelions. She was 9 when she said that the first time. She's 34 now. I turned onto Ridgecroft Drive, and the world rescaled itself. The houses were larger, the driveways longer, the Christmas arrangements out front, the product of professionals. 3-car garages stood behind iron gates. The grounds cost more each month than a mortgage payment in most towns. A stone mailbox slid past with Iron Ridge spelled out in brass. I remembered Fletcher mentioning that name once, some passing reference to a shared deal, the sort of offhand remark that tells you more about a man's inner ledger than any direct conversation could. Then the road curved, and there it was. The Morrow House came into view along a sweeping drive, white birch trees on either side, strung through with lights. It had not been designed for living. It had been designed to make an impression. Stone faced the entire front floor-to-ceiling glass, an entryway that had cost more than my car. Every window glowed. The driveway was a display of wealth, a Range Rover, a pair of SUVs with dealer plates still in the window, a black BMW catching the fairy lights and throwing them back in pieces. I eased the Grand Marquis into the last open space and let the engine wind itself down. My daughter was on the other side of those walls. The 9-minute call moved through my mind again. The returned card. The particular flatness of, "It's fine," a phrase that in her mouth has never once meant what it says. It had always pointed the other direction. I should have understood that sooner. I was understanding it now, parked in another man's driveway with grease still caught under my thumbnail that the shop rag hadn't reached. I got out. The cold hit like something impatient. I straightened my jacket, the charcoal one, the good one, the one Marin picked out for me 12 years ago, still cut the same. Because my body, whatever else may have changed around it, has had the decency to hold its shape. Or, that's what I tell myself. I walked toward the entrance. Through the stone came the muffled push of voices and music, a party well into itself. Somewhere in that sound was my daughter's voice. 4 months since I'd last heard it. That was about to end. I rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately, and it wasn't Sasha. Fletcher Morrow had answered it himself, which struck me as unusual. Houses like this tend to delegate that particular duty. He was taller than I'd remembered, broad across the shoulders, wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, with the collar open in a way that looked casual, but wasn't. His was a face built for being looked at, strong jaw, pale eyes that missed nothing, the bearing of a man who had recognized early that his appearance was an asset worth maintaining. The smile appeared the moment he saw me, wide-practiced, already fully formed, before he'd finished taking me in. "Warren," he said, my name delivered like an item crossed off a list. "Glad you made it." His hand came out firm, rehearsed. The grip of a man who has thought about handshakes. His eyes moved across me in a single pass, the jacket, the Grand Marquis at my back, and I watched him file what he found under whatever heading he kept for men like me. "Come on in," he said, stepping aside. The interior landed like a mild shock to the system. Not unwelcoming exactly, but on a scale the body doesn't quite anticipate. Everything light-colored, oversized, placed with deliberate precision. Ceilings that climbed far beyond any functional need. A staircase that curved through the entry hall, as if someone had drawn it for effect. The furniture had been chosen by a professional chooser. Every room matched in a way no family home actually does, because families accumulate layer by layer over years, while this house had been put together in a single concentrated act of will. In the corner of the living room stood a Christmas tree, 14 feet tall, silver and white, each ornament set exactly where it belonged. I had never stood before a more perfect tree. I had never felt colder looking at one. Deeper in the house, conversation layered over itself, in the low, unhurried register of a gathering well into its evening glassware, ringing laughter, arriving clipped and measured. Fletcher moved ahead through the entry hall, and I followed a step behind my eyes, moving along the photographs arranged on the wall, all of them recent. All of them Fletcher and Sasha, at various occasions a dinner table, a warm weather beach, what appeared to be a ski resort. Sasha was smiling in every one. I reached the 4th photograph before I noticed what should have been obvious from the first. The smiles never quite made it to her eyes. Then she appeared at the far end of the hall. My daughter came toward me in a green dress I hadn't seen before, her hair done with evident care. My first thought was that she was beautiful. My second thought arrived so close behind it, the two nearly merged. She was tired in a way that no cosmetics could entirely cover. "Dad," she said, her voice snagging on the word the way a floor gives just slightly underfoot when you find the weak board. She put her arms around me, and I held on a moment longer than she'd expected, long enough to feel her exhale against my shoulder. The perfume was unfamiliar. The one she'd worn in the years when she had her own apartment. The one Marin had given her for her 25th birthday, something with orange and warmth underneath that was gone. This was something different, chosen for a different purpose perhaps, or chosen to suit someone else, which amounts to the same thing. You look wonderful. I said it because she did, and because two true things can occupy the same moment without one erasing the other. You too, Dad. She touched my arm, then her eyes cut briefly to Fletcher, a quick involuntary check, the kind you make to confirm a burner is off. He'd already pivoted toward the sitting room, waving us along. The other guests were arranged through the living area and around the long table beyond. 10 or 12 of them, the men in blazers, the women in heels, everyone with a glass in hand. Harwick Morrow held a position near the fireplace with a bourbon, and he was the kind of man a room organizes itself around without realizing it. 65 years old, broad through the chest, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly pension, and carrying it as if he'd been measured for it before he could walk. He looked me over the way a person examines something whose worth they haven't yet settled on. "Harwick, you remember Sasha's father," Fletcher said. "Warren, of course." Harwick's handshake was nothing like his son's, heavier, less staged, the grip of a man who stopped considering impressions long ago because that's work he left to other people. "Warren, good of you to come out as if I'd traveled in from somewhere remote and difficult. I wouldn't miss it," I said. A woman I'd never encountered placed a glass of club soda in my hand, without asking what I wanted. I took it and positioned myself near the edge of the room where I could see most of what was happening without being drawn into it. An old habit, 31 years worth of old habits. I watched Sasha move through the room. She refilled glasses before they'd run low. She laughed at things before the punchline arrived. When Fletcher addressed the group, she stood just behind him and slightly to his left, the position of someone who has quietly mapped out exactly how much space they're permitted to occupy. At one point, a woman asked her directly about the house renovation. Sasha drew a breath to answer, and Fletcher answered instead, smoothly without pause, the way a hand changes the station without the eyes leaving the road. Sasha closed her mouth. She picked up a napkin from the table and folded it. I kept my face even and my attention moving, and I held my club soda, and I did the thing I have done across many rooms over many years. I paid very close attention. Then I saw it. Sasha reached across the side table for a coaster, and her sleeve pulled back 2 inches, and what showed on the inside of her wrist told me clearly that something was seriously wrong. The club soda had gone flat while I'd been standing there. I set the glass on the nearest surface and left it. Dinner was called by a woman in a white apron who appeared from the kitchen and said something quiet to Fletcher, and Fletcher brought his palms together once and announced, "All right, everyone, let's eat." The delivery of a man who considers a room full of people moving at his word to be simply the natural order of things. The dining table seated 14. I counted the chairs before sitting, a habit carried over from years spent in rooms where the numbers told you something. The table was dressed with candles and folded cloth napkins, crystal, that fractured the candlelight and sent it in all directions. A centerpiece of spruce boughs and red berries ran the full length of it. Fletcher sat at the head, Harwick to his right. Sasha was 3 chairs down on the left, near enough to the center to suggest she belonged there, far enough from her husband that the suggestion remained only that. I was directed to a seat at the far end, the secondary end where the table tapered slightly and the candles thinned out. A woman named Sylvie, wife of one of Fletcher's business associates, sat next to me and offered the pleasant, composed smile of someone making the best of a stranger beside them. "So, how do you know Fletcher and Sasha?" she asked. "Sasha is my daughter," I said. Her expression shifted, warmer and more measured in the same motion. "Oh, of course I didn't realize." She glanced down the table toward Sasha, then back at me, and I could see her revising something, noting something she'd registered but hadn't labeled yet. I understood. I was seated further from my daughter than the business associates, further than the couple whose name I hadn't caught, further than the woman who apparently handled Fletcher's accounts. I was at that end of the table because Fletcher had placed me there, and Fletcher had placed me there because that was what I represented to him, a peripheral figure, a tolerated obligation, the quiet old man from Simsbury who drove an old car and worked on engines and had nothing worth offering at a table like this one. I unfolded my napkin and laid it across my knee. The first course arrived. Fletcher's voice lifted over the table without any apparent effort, the voice of a man who has never needed to raise it because the rooms he inhabits have always arranged themselves around him. He was describing a development project in Talon County, a mixed-use building, 40 units of luxury residential, above ground floor retail. He used words like footprint and build-out and absorption. Rate the vocabulary of a man who wants you to feel the distance between his language and yours. Warren, Fletcher said, his voice carrying cleanly from one end of the table to the other, smooth as a stone across still water. What was it you did before you retired? Several faces turned my way. Sylvie shifted beside me. I was in transportation, I said. Logistics. Fletcher gave a slow, deliberate nod, the nod of a man performing the act of considering something. Oui, logistics. He turned the word over, the way you repeat a phrase from a language you have no intention of learning. So, driving dispatch, that sort of thing. That sort of thing, I said. Harwick made a sound that stopped just short of a laugh. Honest work, he said, in the tone men use when they mean the work of people who didn't have better options. Nothing wrong with keeping the wheels turning, somebody has to. Somebody does, I agreed. Fletcher smiled across at his father and let that smile open to the room. I always say the backbone of any economy is the people doing the ground-level work. Without them, nothing above it holds. He gestured loosely toward my end of the table as he spoke an open-handed gesture, easy and expansive, the generosity of a man dropping coins into a fountain. He lifted his wineglass to the ground-level work. 2 or 3 voices joined in. Glasses rose. I raised my water and touched it to nothing. I looked at Sasha. She was looking at her plate. Her fork moved through the food in small, absent strokes, the motion of someone who has learned to perform eating without committing to it. I knew that tightness in her shoulders. I recognized it now with the particular clarity that arrives too late, the coiled readiness of someone who has spent so long scanning every room for the temperature of the air that they've lost the ability to simply stand in one without measuring it. My mind went back to the table we had when Sasha was young. A round oak table I bought second-hand from an estate sale in Middletown, the year after Marin and I settled in Simsbury. One edge carried a burn mark where a candle had toppled during a power outage in '98. There was a scratch along the side from the afternoon Sasha resolved at age 7 to teach herself to roller skate in the dining room. 14 years of dinners at that table. No one assigned to a far end. There wasn't one. It was round. That development in Talon County, one of the guests picked up the thread, turning back toward the Fletcher. Wasn't that the project you mentioned last spring, the Millbrook one? Something shifted briefly behind Fletcher's eyes, a tightening that dissolved before anyone else at the table had time to catch it. We took that in a new direction, he said, voice easy, unhurried. Different partners, different positioning. The underlying case is strong. Word was there were complications, the man said. Every build has complications. Fletcher's tone didn't waver, but his right hand traveled to his wineglass and held it. The only question worth asking is where you stand when the dust settles. Harwick filled him in on the Hartford side. Harwick took the floor, and the whole table pivoted toward him, the way a current shifts, and Fletcher's fingers went slack on the glass. I noted everything, said nothing, and kept it all. There, at the end of the table, in the chair Fletcher had chosen for me, precisely where he wanted me to be. What he didn't know was that it suited me just as well. Dinner conversation ran its usual course business. A little weather, the brand of optimism people wear to Christmas gatherings, until a woman on the opposite side, one of the business wives, pearl earrings. A face that meant what it showed looked over at Sasha. Are you still taking on interior design clients? I'm sure Fletcher mentioned something about it at the Hargroves last spring. Sasha straightened almost imperceptibly. Something crossed her features, unguarded, quick, the look of a person asked about a chapter they've closed but haven't yet made peace with. I stepped away from that, she said. We worked out that it made more sense for me. Sasha's where she needs to be running this household, Fletcher said from 3 seats over, gaze still on his plate. Pleasant, settled. The tone of a verdict that wasn't being reopened. A home like this doesn't manage itself. She's exceptional at it. The pearl earrings woman offered Sasha a warm smile. That's really lovely, Sasha returned it. Thank you, she said, took up her fork, and I watched a door close somewhere behind her expression. I turned the phone call over in my mind. Sasha's voice on the line, carrying something I had 67 years of practice at hearing in the people closest to me. She'd told me she was pulling back from her clients, that Fletcher believed the house needed more of her, that funneling her energy into their life together made more financial sense than continuing to build something of her own. I asked what she wanted out of it. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I kept count. "I think this is the right call for us," she said. "Not me, us." The word choice of a woman who has quietly removed herself from the subject of her own life. Sasha had finished at the top of her class at the University of Hartford Interior Design. Then she'd put in 3 years growing a client list out of nothing, driving herself to consultations in a car that had no working heat wrestling sample books up stairwells and walk-up buildings, picking up every call inside the hour, because she'd worked out that availability was the edge she had. She rang me one night from a parking lot in Middletown, too wound up to speak in complete sentences, because someone had passed her name to a hotel group wanting to overhaul 2 Hartford properties. That was 4 years back. She was 30 with something of her own taking shape, and she was happy the way a person gets when the work they're doing is the work they were meant for. Fletcher proposed 8 months after that. My honest first impression of him was favorable. I won't pretend otherwise. He had charm and attentiveness, and the way he looked at my daughter resembled the way a man looks at something precious to him, and I read that as love. It was closer to possession. From far enough away, those two things are nearly indistinguishable. You need proximity patience and a seat at the wrong end of a long table on a Friday in December before the difference becomes legible. The East Wing, she handled the whole thing herself, Fletcher was saying, pivoting now toward the pearl earrings woman, discussing Sasha the way you discuss a well-chosen fixture. Every tile in the main bath, all the built-ins in the study, the whole vision. "It's genuinely beautiful," the woman said, her eyes on Sasha with real feeling. "Thank you," Sasha said. Same words, same register, same shut window. Fletcher leaned over and laid his hand on Sasha's shoulder. Anyone watching from across the room would have seen a husband being tender, the kind of moment that ends up framed. But I'd watched Sasha's body respond to his touch in the entryway, and I watched it respond the same way now. A stiffness faint and instantaneous. Something contracting just under the skin, the body's own language speaking on behalf of a mind still working up to the conclusion. She didn't move toward his hand. She didn't withdraw from it. She'd become expert at neither. Marin used to tell Sasha that real courage was wanting something out in the open, without hedging, without sanding it down to a size that was less likely to draw fire. She said it when Sasha was 15 and couldn't bring herself to tell her friends she was serious about studying art. "Don't let anyone reduce what you want," she told her. "The wanting is not the problem. The wanting is the whole point." Marin said it and died, before she could see how it had landed in the girl who'd listened. I put my fork on the plate rim without making a sound. Harwick had the floor again now, working through a property deal from '94. His voice had an ease that came from never having needed to fight for a room's attention. Fletcher laughed at each beat on cue, calibrated to the moment. The candles held their flame in the still air. My daughter sat 3 seats from her husband and ate from me, moving food around a plate, filling her part of the conversation, wearing her expression, none of it real, all of it practiced. And I arrived with the cold, grinding clarity of someone who has finally stopped finding reasons not to arrive there, at the understanding that she had been receding for 2 years, not in any single visible way, but in the slow accumulation of small surrenders, and I had let it go on. That ended here. I had no clear picture yet of what the rest of the evening would require, but I knew what it would refuse to allow. It would refuse to allow me to point the car home and leave things as they were. Harwick Morrow's voice was built for rooms bigger than most people ever stand in. Not loud, it simply never developed the habit of competing, because no room had ever required it to. He placed his bourbon on the table, settled back, and opened up on the subject of the Morrow family history, the way men like him do, as though the past were a structure they had personally raised and were now generously unlocking for company. 3 generations, he said, raising 3 fingers for the table. My grandfather put a shovel in the ground on his first project in '51, a warehouse in Meriden, 4,200 square feet. Small by any reckoning today, but back then it meant something. It was a man announcing he intended to outlast himself. His eyes moved to Fletcher. "That's how the Morrows operate. You build it. You don't wait for someone to hand it over." Fletcher gave a slow nod, the measured church-going gravity of a man who has been in this congregation many times and accepts his role without requiring a larger one. "The old Fletcher's the one carrying it now," Harwick said, gesturing at his son the way you gesture at a structure bearing your name. "That Meriden warehouse is a tech campus these days. Conversion finished 2 years ago. 60,000 square feet fully occupied, another development on the way. Harwick smiled around the table. The family, he said, had not yet stopped building. A few guests offered sounds of approval. Then somebody brought up the Hartford project, the very one Fletcher had deflected 40 minutes earlier. A muscle moved in Fletcher's jaw. Small. Most people there missed it. The Hartford opportunity is in its final structuring phase, he said, stepping in front of the question before Harwick could get to it. That told me something right there. A man who stands behind his own numbers lets people ask about them openly. A man who is sitting on a problem intercepts the question before it can settle. We're being deliberate about partners. Quality over speed. Smart, said the man who'd asked. He nodded once and went back to his plate. I raised my water glass and watched Fletcher over the rim. 2 Christmases ago, the first one I'd spent at this table, Fletcher had described the Hartford project with the kind of precision that sounds like certainty. 40 units mixed commercial foundation poured by spring. He'd dropped the word transformative into that conversation 3 separate times, and I'd taken note of it the way I take note of most things, quietly, without reaction, letting it sit until it meant something. It was still sitting. 2 springs had passed. The project was still in its final structuring phase. The vocabulary surrounding it had grown looser and more elastic, the way language always shifts once the hard details have become inconvenient. I had put in 31 years alongside men who could describe a fiction in the same even tones they'd use for a fact. That particular sound had become as familiar to me as a wrong note is to someone who's spent a lifetime playing music, recognized not by analysis but by instinct, by an ear that can no longer choose not to hear it. My phone nudged once against my ribs. I touched Sylvie's arm lightly beside me and angled the screen below the table's edge. Denton Alcott. He'd already messaged once earlier that evening. We went back 28 years to the period when I was still building the business from the ground up. And he was a 26-year-old operations manager who simply would not be outworked by anyone I had ever employed. When I sold the company 12 years ago, Denton was the vehicle I sold it through. The holding group that took it over had been structured largely around what he'd built. The message said, "Still in Glastonbury, caught your car on the GPS, everything okay." I hadn't said a word to Denton about tonight. He'd found me the way he always could through the emergency location, share the 2 of us had set up years back when we both operated in situations where knowing the other man's whereabouts was a practical matter, not a courtesy. Neither of us had ever shut it down. I wrote back, "Fine, dinner with Sasha, stay close tonight." The 3 dots came up immediately. Then, how close? I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Harwick's voice carrying down the length of the table. I thought about the way Fletcher had eased the conversation away from everything that mattered. I thought about the Millbrook project repackaged as the Hartford project, suspended indefinitely in its final structuring phase, the phrasing of a man who could talk about construction for hours without ever breaking ground. I thought about the bruise on Sasha's wrist, the outline of a thumb still turning yellow at the margins. I typed, "Close enough to move if I need you to." Back came, "Already moving, say the word." I put the phone away. Harwick's voice drifted down from the far end of the table with the unhurried quality of a man who has just remembered something trivial that nonetheless warrants addressing. "Fletcher tells me you were in logistics. Did you build your own outfit, or were you working under somebody? Or is Then the table turned. Sasha turned with everyone else, and for just a fraction of a second, her eyes carried something that had nothing to do with the careful, neutral expression she had held all night. Something that reached further back than that. The look she used to give me at 10 years old, when something at school was wrong and she hadn't found the language for it yet. A look that asked, "You see this, don't you?" "Keep seeing it." "I ran my own operation," I said. Harwick's nod was slow and deliberate, the nod of a man categorizing an answer somewhere it will never be retrieved. "Good for you," he said. "Small business built this country." "It did," I said. He reached for his bourbon. The table's attention moved off me and dissolved back into the general hum of the room. I looked at my daughter. She'd turned toward her plate again, but something had shifted in the set of her shoulders, just a degree barely visible, and I knew she'd picked up on something in my answer that hadn't registered with anyone else at that table. I was glad. She needed to. Fletcher held off until Harwick had drained his glass, and the table had eased back into the low current of conversation that comes with the second course. Then he settled back in his chair and looked the full length of the table at me, wearing the expression of a man extending a favor. "So, Warren," He said volume calibrated, so the 6 people nearest could catch it without that being the obvious intention. Dad wants to know what you were doing. You said logistics. But what's the actual picture day-to-day routing scheduling? What was the scale of it? His tone had no edge. That was the whole point. He was asking the way an adult asks a child about a drawing, open patient gently expectant, as though whatever came back would be charming. Heads drifted in our direction. Sylvie at my elbow had gone completely still, the stillness of someone who senses a conversation is about to expose something beneath the surface. I put my fork down. I moved things, I said, from where they were sitting to where they needed to go. Fletcher smiled. Right, but what are we talking, a few trucks, regional routes? At our peak, 11 states, I said. 4 overseas partnerships as well. A pause. Brief half a second, maybe a shade under. But I had spent 30 years reading faces across the tables, and I recognized exactly what half a second of silent recalibration looked like when I saw it. Fletcher reached over and took his wine. Huh, so a solid mid-size operation. Regional, good honest work. We came in around $340 million in revenue the last full year before I sold, I said. Give or take. The table did not go quiet. That's worth saying plainly. These were people with enough money and enough training and manners to take a surprise and show none of it. But there was a shift, something collective and involuntary, the kind of imperceptible adjustment a room makes when the pressure through an open door changes the air. Harwick lifted his eyes from his plate. Fletcher's wineglass stopped moving somewhere between the table and his mouth. You sold the company, he said. On 12 years ago, I said, picking up my fork. My wife had just passed. I decided the life I wanted in whatever time I had left didn't require me to keep running it. What did you get for it? Asked one of the men across the table. The husband of the woman with the pearl earrings, the question coming out with the unfiltered directness of a man who had momentarily stopped editing himself. Enough, I said. More than enough. Fletcher set his glass down. The configuration of his face remained in the neighborhood of a smile, but something had shifted in the territory underneath it. The expression of a man who has just realized the chair he's been occupying all evening was never actually his. You never said anything about this, he said, and the line was addressed to Sasha, not to me, carrying an edge that was minor but unmistakable, a blade angle just flat enough to avoid catching the light. Sasha held her husband's gaze. You never asked, she said. 8 words, plain ones. The table received them. So did I. So did Fletcher. And for a moment, the composed surface of the evening showed a fracture nothing wide enough to see but enough that you could feel it underfoot. Harwick got there first, the way men of his particular formation always do, because a lifetime of occupying the most prominent position in any room teaches you to reassert it without the effort being visible. He lifted his fresh bourbon toward me in a brief, unhurried gesture. Self-made man, he said. Nothing wrong with it. Plenty of men raise something up and walk away with the proceeds. Nothing shameful about that. Enjoy your retirement. He delivered the word retirement the way someone says checkered, not quite an insult, but shadowed by the implication that what followed it was a diminishment. I enjoy it just fine, I said. I'm certain you do. He drank. Fletcher had already pivoted his attention, redirected to the man on his left, the subject apparently municipal permits. His voice returned to its ordinary register, the moment folded up and filed for later. But before he turned, I caught the look he sent Sasha's way. Less than a second. A flat measuring thing. Cool. Not anger I could have worked with. This was something colder, the expression of a man who has just received new data and is quietly recalculating what it costs him. A private accounting. Sasha saw it too. I watched it register in her. Some small involuntary thing, a tightening brief and interior, gone before anyone else at the table could have named it. My mind drifted to the morning I made the decision to sell. 14th floor, the building on Asylum Street in Hartford, the city spread out below me, the way it had been for 3 decades while I built something inside it. Maren was gone. The work had always been for her, and for Sasha. But Sasha was grown now, and the work had become its own justification, rather than a means to one. I was 60 years old, and I was done. Papers signed on a Thursday. Come Monday, I was out in Simsbury emptying a garage. What those documents contained was mine to carry, no one else's. The 14th floor, the 11 states, the 4 overseas partnerships. None of that sat at this table with me tonight. The quiet accountant from Canton that Sasha had seen before Fletcher, a man whose name I still carried somewhere in the back of my memory, A chapter that had closed long ago he hadn't known. Neither had the neighbors. Neither had the woman at the hardware store on Route 10. Fletcher hadn't known because the question had never occurred to him to ask. Now it had. I watched him absorb it, folded away somewhere internal, turning to laugh at something the man beside him said. All ease, all composure, the whole performance airtight. Except the hand. His right hand resting next to his wine glass had quietly closed into a fist. It stayed that way. I noted it the way I note everything. No judgment attached, no move made, just a fact added to the ledger, waiting for the moment it might matter. The third course arrived, and the table fractured the way it always does. Smaller clusters, voices overlapping, everyone free to pretend the conversation beside them was out of earshot. Fletcher had shifted his position. His voice was unhurried and smooth as he walked the two men to his left, through a zoning variance in Tolland County, pitching it as something worth jumping on. His hands sketched shapes between them, the instinctive choreography of a man who needs the room to see his vision. I had already turned my attention elsewhere. I was watching Sasha. The salmon on her plate moved left, then right, then back. Almost none of it had made it to her mouth. She was keeping her hands in motion so she didn't have to govern what her face was doing. The wine in her glass hadn't dropped since the appetizers. Still sitting there, still full. These signals don't broadcast. You can only read them if you've logged enough hours with a person to know what normal looks like for them. I knew her normal by heart. Normal used to be seconds on everything, elbows on the table when a story caught her, her hands never still while she spoke. When something truly lit her up, the laugh she produced was large enough that Marin would call out from the other room. That laugh again, as though it were a member of the household, rather than a thing belonging to any one person. 2 years since I'd heard Sasha laugh like that. Sylvie's hand found my forearm for a moment. "She's lovely," she said quietly, just for me. "Your daughter. You must be proud." Every day, I told her. Sylvie held her eyes on Sasha a beat longer. The look of a woman who has registered something and made the judgment that this table, this moment, is not the right place to give it a name. Then she went back to her meal. I had already decided I liked Sylvie. She was taking the room's measure and holding what she found to herself a more refined capacity than most people give it credit for. Down at the far end, Fletcher's voice changed, not in volume, in quality. It moved into a different key, the one that belongs to performance rather than to genuine exchange. A story about a contractor who misread a blueprint. He had told it before. You could tell by the confidence with which he paced himself toward the punchline. It hit. Then Sasha. His voice carried the length of the table, like it had every right to sliding through the gap in the other noise the way current finds an opening in rock. Tell everyone about the kitchen tile, the installer, the mix-up on the order. Eyes moved to Sasha with the patient attentiveness of people who have been directed towards something. She lifted her gaze from the plate. Something crossed her face, a quiet, bracing interior, the steadying a person does when they're about to say something, in a room where the outcome isn't nothing. "It wasn't a big deal," she said. "The right tiles showed up inside a week." Fletcher met the table's eyes with a grin. The shipment arrived wrong, and she had the supplier on the phone within 10 minutes. A manager involved inside 20. Written confirmation of an expedited replacement before lunch. While she was running 2 other contractors on the same floor, he let that warm proprietary look settle on her. When she decides something is going to get done, it gets done. Someone said, impressive. Sasha's smile went to the tablecloth. It was one phone call. Fletcher spread his palms open toward the room. "You see what I mean? She will never take the credit." When he swung back toward his end, I watched my daughter's face. The smile was still there, the well-maintained social kind engineered for duration. But underneath it, something had pulled tight the way a rope pulls tight when the weight at the other end has exceeded what the rope was built to hold. Fork lifted. Salmon nudged to one side. Fork back down. I was somewhere else a Saturday morning years ago. Sasha at 12 coming downstairs in her pajamas and finding me at the stove working through a stack of pancakes. She paused in the doorway. "Dad, how do you know when something's wrong, but there's no specific thing you can point to?" I told her, "Same way you know a room smells off. Not bad necessarily, just not the smell it's supposed to have." She turned that over for a few seconds, said, "Okay," came and sat down and put away 4 pancakes without raising the subject again. That conversation had come back to me over the years more than once. It was coming back now. Something in this room was off. It had been there since I walked in. Nothing singular, nothing you could lift out and display as evidence every element had a reading that made sense on its own. But assembled, they didn't resolve to fine. Fletcher said something to Harwick. Both of them laughed, and Harwick settled a hand on his son's shoulder, the quiet satisfaction of two men whose picture of the world was built from identical materials and who remained pleased by the fact. Sasha was watching. Her shoulders rose barely a fraction, the rehearsed physical brace of someone who has seen that particular moment enough times to understand the range of what it can precede. I set my napkin beside the plate. Under the table, my hand closed around my phone. I didn't move. The moment wasn't here yet, but I held onto it the way you hold on to something you know you'll need, with the stillness of a man whose patience has finally exhausted itself, replaced by something that isn't urgency but resembles readiness. Not anger, stiller than anger. A door that was now visible. Sasha reached across for her water glass, and the sleeve drew back from her wrist. For a half second, the candlelight caught the mark there, and what it reminded me of was this: she had been carrying something alone for a long time, and had never once asked for help carrying it. I looked at the mark, then at Fletcher, then at her face. She had seen me see it. 2 full seconds her sleeve didn't move. She held my gaze. In those 2 seconds, she communicated everything that hadn't been said across 4 months. The short-clipped calls, the birthday cards that came back, unopened the 9-minute conversations that stopped dead, the instant a voice reached her from somewhere in the background. Then she looked away. And I understood, with the kind of certainty that comes only to a man who has stopped letting himself doubt, that tonight was not going to end the way Fletcher Morrow had mapped it out. He refilled his own wine, without a glance around the table to check whether anyone else's glass was empty. A small thing. The kind of thing that means nothing standing alone and means a great deal once you've been keeping count. Then his eyes went to Sasha, his voice unhurried, pleasant, the tone of a man noting something he expects to be handled. "Honey, you haven't touched your plate. Our guests are going to think there's something wrong with the food." Eyes drifted her way with the polite attentiveness of people who have been offered a reason to look. Sasha glanced down at her plate, then back up at Fletcher. And then she did something I hadn't seen from her in 2 full years. She gave him nothing. She didn't rearrange her expression to suit the scene he was staging. "I'm not hungry," she said. "You haven't eaten anything since this morning." His tone was measured, mild, the voice of a man constructing a portrait of reasonableness for the benefit of an audience. "You should eat, Sasha. You know how you get." That last sentence settled into the room and stayed. You know how you get. 4 words with an entire architecture buried inside them. The implication that her moods were weather systems, forces beyond her control, that her appetite or the absence of it was a condition he had learned to navigate. Evidence that he was the stable one, and she was the variable. Sylvie's fork went still. Sasha's jaw tightened. 1 degree, barely visible. I caught it because I have been reading that jaw for 47 years, and I know its complete range. "I'm not hungry, Fletcher," she said. Half a register lower, the pleasantness still present at the surface, but something solid beneath it, now a boundary being drawn, in the space underneath the actual words. "We have guests." "I'm aware we have guests." She set her fork on the plate. Not a drop. Nothing impulsive, a deliberate, measured sound. The sound made by a person placing something down with full intention. "I have been at this table with your guests for 3 hours. I have smiled at your guests. I have answered their questions or started to answer them, and you have come in and finished my sentences, and I have smiled through that too." Her voice hadn't risen. If anything, it had dropped, settling into a register below normal conversation, the register of a woman who has learned that stillness carries more authority than volume. "I am not hungry." That is a complete sentence. It doesn't require managing. The table went the particular kind of quiet that occurs when every person present is working strenuously to appear uninvested, while actually listening with their entire being. Harwick set his bourbon glass down with careful deliberateness. Something moved across Fletcher's face in the space of 2 seconds. A fast internal negotiation between the self he assembled for rooms like this, and whatever lived beneath that assembly, the assembled self held barely. "Sweetheart," he said, offering the table a smile, the smile of a man inviting others to share in a private frustration he finds charming. She gets this way when she's overtired. "Sasha, why don't you slip away and lie down for a bit?" "I don't want to lie down." Her hands had come to rest flat against the tablecloth, both palms pressed gently to the surface, the way a person braces against emotion only they can sense. "I don't want to go to another room. I don't want to come back in a few minutes smoothed into someone different from who I am sitting here right now." She looked at her husband across the candlelight, across the crystal, and the spruce bough centerpiece, and the Christmas tree burning in the next room with all its careful arranged light. All of it, the whole constructed landscape of the life he had built around her. "I don't want any of this. I haven't wanted it for a long time. I just didn't know how to say that until tonight, sitting here with my father, watching me not eat." The room held its breath. Fletcher's smile had gone. What replaced it wasn't anger. Not yet. Something colder than anger, more deliberate. The look of a man rapidly assessing the degree of damage and sorting through whatever options remain. "We are not doing this here," he said, voice low and controlled. "You said we have guests," Sasha said. "So here appears to be where we are." Harwick made a sound low and purposeful, not a word exactly. More a clearing of the throat that in his usage functioned as a directive. He looked at Sasha the way a man looks at something that has moved outside the boundaries assigned to it. "Young lady," he said in the tone of a man who has used that phrase his entire life as a mechanism for making women smaller. "I think perhaps it's been a long evening. Why don't you—" Harwick Warren's voice came out of me before I had consciously decided to use it. He stopped. I hadn't raised it. I didn't need to. There is a register a man develops across 30 years of rooms, where the words matter and the delivery matters more, not volume, but mass, a frequency that carries weight rather than noise. And Harwick Morrow heard the weight, and knew it the way one creature knows another that is not the smaller of the two. "Let her finish," I said. The table went perfectly still. Sasha looked at me. Her eyes were bright, not on the edge of tears, but lit with something that had been waiting a long time for enough air to sustain itself. She drew herself upright one vertebra at a time until she was sitting the way she used to sit at our round oak table in Simsbury, like someone who holds full title to the chair beneath her. "I'm done," she said, not to the table, to Fletcher. "I've been done for a while." I just needed to say it somewhere I could hear myself say it. Fletcher held her gaze a long moment. Then his eyes moved to me. I looked back at him with the same quality of stillness I had held across negotiating tables, conference rooms, deals that dragged on for 3 days, and came down in the end to who ran out of patience first. The stillness of a man who has made his decision, carries no remaining obligation to rush, and has nothing left he needs to prove. Fletcher was the one who looked away. He stood up. Nobody had indicated the evening was concluding. The other guests hadn't stirred. The candles were still burning. The Christmas tree still lit in the adjoining room, the woman in the white apron still somewhere in the kitchen. None of the ordinary signals that precede a man leaving a table were there. He simply rose, and the rising altered something in the room. The way a change in barometric pressure shifts the air before weather comes. Not announced, not loud, but different in a way the body registers before the mind has processed it. Sasha felt it. I watched her feel it. Her hands, which had been lying open on the table, retreated to her lap, and her posture drew inward by a degree the reflexive contraction of someone who has conditioned themselves to occupy less space whenever a room's atmosphere tilts in a particular direction. "Excuse us," Fletcher said to the table, the performance still running. The smile still in place, though pulled thinner now at the edges. "Sasha and I just need a moment." He came around the table toward her, unhurried, self-possessed, the movement of a man who regards the room as his own and is simply crossing it. Sylvie's fingers found her water glass and wrapped around it without lifting it. Harwick watched his son with the expression of a man observing a chess move he has seen before and considers correct. "Fletcher?" My voice came out flat and quiet. "Sit down." He did not sit down. He reached Sasha's chair and took a position behind it and said something down to her, something angled low, meant to carry no further than her ears. Whatever it was, the muscles across the back of her neck pulled taut in a way I could sense from the far end of the table. Sasha pushed her chair back and stood. Whether she rose because she chose to, or because remaining seated felt like the more dangerous position, I can't say with certainty. I have turned that question over many times since. A clean answer has never arrived. What followed took less than 4 seconds. I know because I counted the way I have counted across an entire professional life, the way you count when the number is going to matter, and you already understand that someone will ask you to account for it. Fletcher moved towards Sasha in a way that stopped the room cold. Every person at that table understood in the same instant that something had gone badly wrong. There was a sound sharp and dense, a sound with real mass behind it, the kind produced when a body meets something solid that won't give. Then a second sound, lower and shorter breath, forced from a person faster than the person intended. Then the wall. What happens next changed everything for Sasha, for Fletcher, and for every person sitting in that room. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If someone you loved was being slowly hollowed out by the person they trusted most, would you wait for them to ask for help, or would you move quietly on your own? The crack was visible from my chair. 6 inches clean through the drywall at the exact height of a shoulder. I registered it. Then I registered my daughter. Then I registered the distance between the two. Whatever had been banked down in me across 31 years of professional life, all that trained stillness, all that cultivated patience, something older and louder than any of it had just come through. Sasha had sunk to one knee against the wall, one palm flat on the floor beneath her bracing. Her eyes were open wide. She was breathing in tight, shallow pulls. The look she had fixed on Fletcher was one I had never seen her face carry before. Fear wasn't quite the word. Fear was where you started. This was further along the look of someone who has crossed that threshold enough times that the shock of finding herself there again has worn away. Fletcher tugged his jacket straight. "Good," said Harwick Morrow from his chair on the right side of the table. Quiet settled the voice of a man announcing a conclusion he arrived at some time ago. He lifted his bourbon and gave his son one nod. That single word went into the room and took up residence. I have sat in a great many rooms across this life. I have heard men say things they had no right to say, and felt entitled to say anyway. I have held my face neutral through all of it, because neutrality is a muscle, and you build it through repetition until the repetition disappears and it simply becomes how you are. But what moved through me when Harwick spoke that word had no connection to muscle or discipline or the 67 years of patience I had assembled. It came from somewhere that preceded all of that, and it was considerably less complicated. What happened next in that room is something I have returned to many times since the instant when everything carefully concealed finally broke the surface and a man found out what it actually costs to assume no one has been paying attention. Before we reach that, consider this. If someone you loved was being worn down quietly by someone you had trusted, would you move the moment doubt arrived? Or would you hold until you were sure that question is where my daughter's name lived? Sylvie made a small involuntary sound, the sound of a person receiving an understanding she had been trying not to receive. One of the other guests shifted back from the table, not a word from anyone. Fletcher's eyes went to Harwick, and something crossed between them, the private shorthand of two men whose convictions are shared deep enough that they require no articulation, only acknowledgement. I got to my feet. No skidding chair, no elevated voice. None of the things a different man might have produced from a moment like that. I rose from my seat at the far end of the table, the chair I had been placed in the chair at the margin, the one assigned to a man whose presence was permitted, because outright exclusion would have created its own problem. Then I walked the length of that room, hands at my sides, face carrying nothing beyond the look of a man executing something he decided on some time ago. I got to Sasha before Fletcher had finished working out that I was moving. I stepped into the gap between them. No announcement, no performance. My body between my daughter and her husband. The way you'd put your hand around a candle flame, not to snuff it, but to prevent it from touching what lay beyond it. Sasha's hand came to my arm. She gripped it hard. Her fingers were cold. She was shaking in the controlled, effortful way of someone who has decided that they are not going to shake and is spending real energy making that true. I put my hand over hers. "I've got you," I said, keeping my voice low. "I've got you." Then I looked back at Fletcher Morrow over my shoulder without saying a word, because certain messages lose something the moment you try to put language to them, and this was one of those. I moved Sasha toward the hallway with my hand at her back, resting there gently enough that she could pull away from it at any point. She did not pull away. She walked with me, not speaking, both arms folded in against her body, holding herself in the deliberate, conscious way of someone who has discovered that it doesn't happen on its own, that it requires active effort, that you either do it or it undoes itself. Behind us, Harwick's voice addressed the table, in the tone of a man reasserting that things were under control, that the disruption had passed, that everyone should carry on. A chair moved. Fletcher's voice came quieter than usual, and tightly governed in the way of something that takes effort to govern. I didn't turn back. In the hallway, Sasha stopped walking. She turned to look at me directly, and for the first time that evening, There was nothing between us, no table, no room full of guests with their requirements, no performance in progress. Her eyes were dry. That landed first. She hadn't wept. Her jaw was set. The color had come up in her face. The fine tremor in her hands was still there, still running, but her eyes were clear and they were on mine. "Dad," she said. Her voice was steadier than the moment had any right to produce. Steadier, I think, than she had expected from herself. "Are you hurt?" I asked. She gave the question its proper weight, the pause of someone locating an honest answer rather than a fast one. "My shoulder," she said. "It's not bad." "Okay." "I need you in the kitchen," I told her. "Not the dining room, the kitchen. Find the woman who's been serving and ask her for water and sit down." "What are you going to do?" "Make a phone call." She held her eyes on mine for a moment, and something moved across her face that I couldn't find a clean word for. Some part of it was relief. Beneath that, a grief that had been in storage for a long time, and had only just now located the air it needed to surface the specific grief of a daughter who has just had it confirmed that her father knows what's been happening and will not pretend otherwise. "Okay," she said, and then, "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't." "Don't," I said, not sharply, with certainty. The way you seal off a sentence that would lead someone somewhere. There is no reason to go right now. "We'll talk later. Kitchen, go." She went. I watched her pass through the door at the far end of the hallway. Then I turned, walked to the front of the house, and stepped outside into December. The cold reached me like something clarifying, sharp and clean, carrying more honesty than anything that house had held all evening. The lights in the birch trees were still lit, winding up the pale trunks, and the snow was coming down in that unhurried drifting way, in no particular rush to land, taking its time about touching anything below. I stood on the front step. Just a moment. Then I found my phone and dialed Denton Alcott. First ring. Warren, alert and ready. Denton had been handling operations for more than 2 decades and had the particular quality of a man who reads a changed situation without needing to be told it has changed. "Talk to me. I need you at this address." I gave it to him. 99 Stonefield Court, Glastonbury. "Do you know it? I can be there in 12 minutes. "I'm going to need more than just you, Denton." A brief pause, focused. "How much more?" I looked back toward the dining room window. The crack in the drywall was still visible from where I stood, outside 6 inches long at shoulder height, the kind of thing that spackle can cover, but cannot actually fix. I thought about Sasha's shoulder. I thought about Harwick Morrow's voice from that chair on the right side of the table, issuing his verdict in the unhurried, satisfied tone of a man who has made that kind of pronouncement many times over, and has never had anyone push back. "Enough," I said. "Enough that when they see it there's no question about what it means." 3 seconds of silence from Denton. When he spoke again, I heard the register I remembered from 30 years ago. The register of a man who has just been handed something real and is already solving it. "Irina Voss is in Hartford tonight. I can get her there." "Good, I need her." "Baird Fenwick is with me. He's been working through something you'll want to know about." "Bring him Denton." A pause. "Is Sasha all right?" I turned and looked at the house. Through those tall front windows, the edge of the dining room was still visible. Candles burning, guests in their seats, the architecture of a normal evening still being maintained. Somewhere beyond the hallway in the kitchen, my daughter was sitting with a glass of water and a trembling she had not yet been able to stop. "She will be," I said. 12 minutes, Warren. Keep your phone on." "I always do." I ended the call and remained in the snow for another minute, not because I was lacking for resolve, because the cold out there was honest, and I needed that particular kind of honesty. Before I went back through that door, returned to my chair at the end of that table, and waited. The waiting was what cost the most, more than the phone call, more than crossing that dining room, more than any single action I had taken. 31 years had taught me that acting before the moment is ready for you is the most dangerous thing a man can do. That the difference between effective and reckless is almost always a matter of patience. The men who prevailed in the rooms I had worked in across a career, they weren't the loudest or the most forceful. They were the ones who grasped that timing governs everything else and who could hold themselves still long enough for it to arrive. The timing was 15 minutes out. I put my phone away. I brushed the snow from my shoulders. I walked back down the hallway and took my seat at the far end of the table. Fletcher looked at me. I reached for my water glass, drank from it without hurrying, set it back down, and let my gaze settle on nothing in particular. the look of a man who has no remaining urgency and nothing left to establish. Fletcher looked away first. I started counting minutes. 7:52. I know that time precisely because I checked my watch as I sat down the old bova my father gave me the year I started the company. The one with the crack in the crystal I have never had repaired because fixing it always felt like erasing something. 7:52. 15 minutes out from what Denton had said was 15 minutes. Fletcher had re-established himself at the head of the table with the smooth ease of a man who has learned that the most effective way to make an incident disappear is to conduct yourself as though it never took place. He was talking about a ski trip to Vermont he and Sasha were planning for February, his voice carrying the warm, proprietary confidence of someone who has already bought the future he's describing and has no doubt about who it belongs to. Sasha had not come back from the kitchen. No one mentioned it. That was what settled into me like a weight as I took in the faces around that table. 10 people. Educated, well-dressed people carrying the ordinary moral instincts that most human beings arrive with. And not one of them had said a word. Not to Fletcher, not to Harwick, not to me. They had reorganized themselves around what had occurred, the way water reroutes around an obstacle fluidly without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would have required something from them they found easier not to give. Sylvie was the exception. She wasn't speaking. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her meal untouched, her eyes moving between Fletcher and the hallway door, with the measured attention of a woman in the process of reaching a decision. I respected that. I didn't say anything to her, but I respected it. 7:56. Fletcher was describing the lodge amenities, mountain views from the master suite. Harwick cut in twice with comparisons to a place he favored in Stowe, and Fletcher deferred each time with the particular attentiveness of a man who has never entirely stopped performing for that one specific audience. The guests laughed at the right moments. Wine was poured. The woman in the white apron came through from the kitchen and moved around the table, clearing the third course. She worked with the practiced near-invisible efficiency of someone who has made a craft of being present without registering. I watched the kitchen door as she came through it. In the brief gap before it swung back shut, I caught a glimpse of Sasha, perched on a stool by the counter holding a glass of water in both hands, the way you hold something when what you need is something to hold. Her head was down. The trembling in her hands had quieted. She was breathing deliberately, using each breath as something to anchor herself to. Then the door swung closed. 7:58. Harwick said something further about Stowe, and one of the men laughed a beat too hard. The laugh of someone marking time in a conversation they are ready to be through with. Fletcher's eyes moved briefly to the hallway door and came back. A quick involuntary check. I noted it the way I note things. He was tracking Sasha's return, not from concern, but from management. He wanted her back at the table before the evening ended, so that the close of it read as unremarkable, so the guests left carrying a particular impression, so that whatever account of the evening took shape would be the one he had authored. He did not yet know that a different account was already being written. 8:01. Talk had drifted to holiday travel, the reliable neutral terrain, that gatherings retreat to once the real subjects have become too charged to approach. Someone was flying to Phoenix. Someone else had family in Charlotte. Harwick was returning to Stowe, as he had already taken care to establish. Inside my jacket, my phone gave a single pulse. One vibration, the signal Denton and I had developed 3 decades ago when we were running operations across 11 states and needed a check-in that could work in rooms where answering a call wasn't possible. 1 vibration in position, 2 delay, 3 abort. 1 vibration in position. 8:04. I lifted my water glass, drank, returned it to the table, and let my eyes find the crack in the dining room wall. Fletcher had positioned himself with his back to it. Harwick had not looked at it once since it happened. The crack was 6 inches long, running diagonally at shoulder height through the drywall, and it was the most honest thing in the room. Sylvie caught me looking at it. Our eyes met for a moment before she looked away, but not before I saw the expression of a woman who has been trying to talk herself out of what she already understands, and has now stopped trying. 8:06. Fletcher was mid-sentence about the Vermont Lodge's proximity to a particular trail system when the sound reached us. Subtle at first, a low collective note, the sound of multiple engines running in close formation, the acoustic signature of large displacement motors at idle. The kind of thing you feel in your sternum, a beat before your ears identify it. One guest slowed mid-sentence, then another. Then the windows began to fill with light, not suddenly. Gradually, the way dawn builds, except it was coming from the wrong direction and arriving in the wrong color. White, precise, multiplying. Headlights tracked across the birch trees and the snow and the stone face of the house in a slow, deliberate procession. One set, then another, until the dining room windows held a reflected brightness that had no business being there at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening in December. Fletcher stopped talking. Harwick turned in his chair toward the glass. The engines had settled into a low collective idle, the sound of things that have arrived and see no need to hurry. In the stillness that came over the dining room, 10 people turning toward the windows and the gathering light outside, I set my water glass down for the last time and folded my hands on the table in front of me. 15 minutes. Denton Alcott was always exactly on time. Harwick Morrow stood up. In the 3 hours I had been in that house, I had not once seen him leave his chair. He had held his position at the right side of the table, with the settled authority of a man who believes the world is correctly arranged when it comes to him. Watching him rise, now turning toward the window, bourbon still in hand, wearing an expression I had not seen on him at any point in the evening. Something between bewilderment and the early signals of alarm. I understood that the vehicles in the driveway were already performing their first function before a single door had opened. There were 12 of them. I knew because I had asked for 12, and Denton Alcott had never in 28 years delivered anything other than precisely what was asked, all black. Rolls-Royce Phantoms arranged along the curved driveway with the kind of precision that implies something deliberate, their headlights throwing the birch trees and the snow and the stone front of the house into a wash of white that reduced the fairy lights threaded through the branches to something thin and insufficient by comparison. The engines cut simultaneously. That was what registered most. Not the vehicles themselves, not their number. The silence that came after when 12 engines stopped at the exact same instant. A silence that carried more mass than the sound preceding it had. Weight in it. Intention in it. One of the guests said quietly, "What is that?" Nobody answered. Fletcher was already moving toward the front door. I got up from my end of the table and went after him. Behind me, chairs scraped, and other guests rose the reflex of people pulled towards something they can't yet name. Fletcher pulled the front door open. Cold air pressed in immediately, carrying with it the sound of footsteps on the stone drive. Even paced without urgency, the sound of people who have already decided what they came to do. Denton Alcott was the first face I recognized, 60 years old. The frame of a man who had spent 3 decades in the business of moving things, and the posture of a man who had spent those same 3 decades being the one who determined where they went. Dark overcoat. No tie. That was Denton's signal. The situation is serious, but I am not here to perform that seriousness for an audience. Next came Irina Voss, a leather document case under her arm, her movements economical and exact, a woman who takes up precisely the space required and no margin beyond it. Behind her, Baird Fenwick, broad through the shoulders, unhurried in his step hands empty. That last detail I noted. Anything he had brought was already held in his mind, where it had been sitting long enough to settle. Behind those 9 more figures fanned out across the driveway, standing in the snow, with their arms down and their expressions neutral, present still not speaking. People from earlier chapters of my working life. People whose companies I had helped keep standing in bad years. A man to whom I had extended money in 1999, when credit markets seized and the banks had looked the other way. A woman whose transportation contract I had personally signed for, when no other guarantor would touch it. None of them were here, because I had asked. I don't ask. I had called Denton. Denton had called 3 people. Those 3 had called others. 12 hours after that, 12 cars were in Fletcher Morrow's driveway on a Friday night in December, because 30 years of doing things the right way when it finally gets to matter looks like this. Denton came up to the front step. He considered Fletcher with the settled, calibrated look of a man whose assessment was already complete and was now simply being verified. Then his eyes came to me. A single nod. "Warren," he said. "Denton," I said. Fletcher's attention moved between us. "Who are you?" He was holding his composure, but the effort was visible. "What is this? This is my property. You can't—" "Denton Alcott." Denton said, his tone even and easy. "Chairman of Alcott Consolidated Group. 11 subsidiary companies across the Northeast. 2 international partnerships. Warren Halcourt built the foundation those companies were grown from. He sold to me 12 years ago at a figure that was never made public because he asked that it not be, and I kept that because that is the sort of man he is. A pause. And you are Fletcher Morrow. We need to talk about your company. The color went out of Fletcher's face the way it drains from a face when something true has just arrived, evenly, steadily, without drama. Harwick stepped into the doorway behind his son. He took stock of the 12 cars. He took stock of Denton. He took stock of the people standing in rows across the driveway in the snow without a word between them. Something entered his face that hadn't been there across any of the prior 3 hours. Not recognition of the individuals, recognition of what they represented. That specific quality of organized, patient, self-assured power that feels no obligation to announce itself, because announcing yourself is the behavior of someone who doubts whether they'll be heard. Nobody standing in that driveway doubted it. Harwick Morrow had spent 65 years walking into rooms as the dominant force in them. He was looking at a group of people who had never encountered his name. I stepped around Fletcher and stood beside Denton on the front step. I turned back toward the entryway and looked down the hall toward the kitchen, and I raised my voice just enough to reach it. "Sasha, come out here, please." Silence. Then the kitchen door moved. My daughter walked the length of the hallway, with her chin-up arms at her sides, her eyes on mine from the moment she had them. I watched her come through the front door and out into the December air and settle beside me. I felt the shift in her when she took in what occupied the driveway, the light, the stillness, all those people who had come out on a winter night on account of a single phone call from her father. She looked up. "Dad," she said quietly. "Who are all these people who owe me nothing?" I told her, "and showed up anyway. That's the only kind that means anything." We went inside because the cold out there was real, even if almost nothing else about the evening had been. Denton entered first, then Irina, then Baird, and the three of them changed the character of the room they walked into. The difference between sealed air and air that has somewhere to go. The remaining guests had gathered near the living room entrance, unclear on whether they were leaving or staying, doing what people default to when a situation hasn't been explained to them, which is nothing until someone explains it. Fletcher stationed himself in the middle of the entryway, arms at his sides, jaw locked, the posture of a man who is confused occupying a space with owning the terms of it. "I'm not sure what you're under the impression you're doing," he said to Denton. "But whatever this is, it finishes here in this house, and it finishes the way I say it does." Denton listened to that with the patience of a man who has heard variations on the same sentence more times than he could calculate and has never once let it redirect him. "Of course," he said. "Why don't we sit?" The way he said it made clear it wasn't a question. We went into the living room. Harwick settled himself into the armchair, closest to the fireplace, the chair that carries the most authority in that room. And I registered that the bourbon in his hand had disappeared and hadn't been replenished, which told me where his focus had gone. Sasha sat down beside me on the sofa, her arm against mine, and I could feel her breathing measured, deliberate, the same steadying rhythm she had found in the kitchen. Fletcher stayed on his feet. "Fletcher," Denton said, same easy tone. "Sit down, please. This is going to take a few minutes, and it works better for everyone if you're not standing above us while I walk through it." Something gave way in Fletcher's expression. He sat. Denton stayed standing, not by accident. He positioned himself in the center of the room, hands settled in, his coat pockets, eyes on Fletcher. The look of a man preparing to relay facts he finds neither complicated nor charged, simply factual. "Warren Halcourt started Halcourt Logistics in 1987, he said. He was 32 years old at the time. He had $149,000 in capital, a used truck, and a commercial driver's license. By 2001, the company was active across 11 states, had 412 people on payroll, and was turning $340 million in gross annual revenue. In 2005, Warren put together freight partnerships with operators in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany, the first regional logistics company of that scale in the country to accomplish it and come out ahead. The room stayed quiet. In 2011, Denton went on, Warren sold the company to a holding group I structured and primarily financed. The transaction price was never disclosed publicly. What I can tell you is that it was the largest private logistics deal in Connecticut's history at that point. What I can also tell you is that Warren secured contractual protections for all 412 employees, a guaranteed minimum of 3 years following the acquisition. Nothing obligated him to do that. He did it anyway. Harwick sat motionless in the armchair. Fletcher was staring at me. The jacket, the plain shoes, the face of a man who had pulled up to his house in a car that was 14 years old. I could watch the recalculation running behind his eyes. An entire evening's architecture of assumptions was losing its footing. After the sale, Denton said, Warren's wife Maren died. He relocated to Simsbury. He spent time on things in his garage. He ran his errands on Tuesdays. The car he'd owned for 6 years kept working, so he saw no reason to trade it in. Denton stopped for a moment. The people standing outside tonight came because Warren reached out, not because he was calling in what's owed. Warren doesn't traffic in what's owed. Relationships are a different kind of currency. They accumulate over decades. They're held together by who a person actually is, and they don't spoil. The majority of those people standing in that driveway had been in Warren's life for upwards of 20 years, a handful closer to 30. Tonight they'd come because Warren Halcourt's word carries its own weight. When he asks, the asking is enough. Fletcher's throat worked. I don't understand, he said, and something had vacated his voice. That polished assurance he'd worn all evening, the hum of a man who moves through rooms assuming ownership of them, was simply gone. He was directing the question at me. I studied my son-in-law from across that living room, a house raised on other people's money, filled with an audience he'd been performing at all night. 31 years of my own life rose up in me, all the rooms where restraint was the point, where what you swallowed outweighed what you offered. I answered with the only version of it that was honest. You never asked about me, I said. Not really. You asked what I drove, what my resume looked like, what value I might add to your table. Those aren't the same thing as wanting to know a person. The ones who genuinely wanted to know me didn't lead with any of that. They came and they paid attention. Sasha was the one I was facing when the words left me. Her eyes were clear, her chin level. She reached across and placed her hand over mine, where it rested on the cushion. I turned my palm up to meet hers and felt her fingers close nothing, like that cold, faltering grip from dinner. This was steadier, purposeful. The grip of someone who has touched ground again after a long freefall and is beginning to believe it won't give way. It wouldn't. Irina Voss reached into her document case. Mr. Morrow. Her gaze found Fletcher and held it. 23 years of family and financial law had given her voice a particular quality, composed without being ceremonial precise, without ever confusing politeness for weakness. I think the moment has arrived to discuss Morrow Construction Group. Nothing about it was theatrical. No stack of documents fanned across the table, no exhibits held aloft. She drew out a single-bound report and rested it on the cushion at her side. The move of a woman who learned long ago that stillness hits harder than spectacle. Morrow Construction Group. She continued had been delivering audited financials to its lenders for the last 4 fiscal years, each showing revenue climbing reliably upward. 31 million in year 1, 38 in year 2, 44 in year 3, 51 projected for the current year. She let the numbers stand on their own. Baird Fenwick eased himself forward in his chair. He'd said nothing since the group moved inside, a large, deliberate man whose stillness communicated more than restlessness ever could. He laid a second report alongside Irina's. What those numbers conceal, he said, is a considerably different picture. He'd spent 6 weeks dissecting Morrow Construction's actual financial state. Bank draw records, contractor invoices, materials, receipts, payroll ledgers. Not the version submitted to lenders, but the underlying transactions those filings were built on top of. His eyes settled on Fletcher. That business hasn't generated a profit in 3 years. Liabilities are outpacing assets by somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.8 million. 8 months ago, 2 active sites went dark because the subcontractors stopped getting checks. The Millbrook project came back under a renamed entity in the spring, then stalled again when the lead lender called the note, having determined that the claimed completion percentages had almost no connection to what existed on the ground. The room absorbed it slowly, the way a space absorbs something dense lowered into it from above. Fletcher's hands rested open on his knees. His face wore the look of a man who has finally run out of corridor, a verdict he'd been evading now standing directly in front of him. Preliminary figures, he said, careful, measured. You're isolating one moment in a longer story. Construction cash flow is cyclical by nature. Any qualified analyst would tell you that. I am a qualified analyst, Baird said. No heat in it. no rush. 19 years as a senior examiner with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, then private practice. North of 300 construction balance sheets in that span. I know what a rough cycle looks like. I also know what insolvency looks like. This is the second one. Fletcher had nothing to offer. Irina continued. Over the preceding 22 months, she said Morrow Construction Group had been pulling from a home equity line of credit secured against the marital home. Those draws total $430,000. The property is jointly titled in Fletcher and Sasha Morrow's names. Only then did she turn to face Sasha directly. Sasha, were you ever informed that this line was open? Did your consent go on any of these documents? Sasha's grip on my hand tightened. No, she said. I was never told any line of credit existed. I knew nothing about it. That's exactly what I anticipated, Irina said gently, but without any softness meant to cushion the blow. Connecticut law requires both spouses to provide written authorization before a jointly held property can be used as loan security. Your name is on the consent paperwork, Sasha. The handwriting analysis our experts conducted found that the signature present there bears no match to your authenticated signature of record. She paused a beat, then moved forward. There was more. The inheritance Sasha had received following her mother's death funds, held solely in her name, had been pledged as collateral against a commercial loan Morrow Construction closed in March of last year. The pledge was made without her awareness and without any authorization from her. No one in that room uttered the word forgery. There was no need. It was already occupying the space fixed and legible the way a crack in plaster announces itself to anyone willing to look long before anyone bothers to name it. Harwick cleared his throat. What is being alleged here is of an extremely serious nature, he said. That measured gravity in his voice was well practiced. He'd used it before, and usually it ended things. My counsel is that no one present say another word without legal representation in this room. Wise advice. Irina said, her tone unhurried and even. You might consider applying it to yourself, Mr. Morrow, particularly regarding the Berkshire Summit Capital Partners loan that closed in February of this year, the one carrying your signature as co-signatory. She moved to the next page. Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 1343 classifies the submission of falsified financial documentation in connection with commercial lending as wire fraud. Both of those loan applications rested on the fabricated figures Baird just walked through. Your name is on one of them, Mr. Morrow. That doesn't leave you watching from the seats. That places you on the floor. Something moved across Harwick's face, a shift I hadn't seen from him once during the entire evening. Something departed. Not fear he hadn't arrived there yet. Harwick Morrow didn't reach fear quickly. But uncertainty was different territory, and for a man of his construction, uncertainty cut like a structural crack, a fissure spreading through something that had always trusted the forces would arrive from directions it could anticipate. There's something I want to say, I said. Every face in the room came around to me. I'd sat quiet long enough that perhaps the expectation I'd speak again had faded entirely. I didn't gather everyone here to corner anybody. I did it because my daughter has lived inside a set of circumstances whose actual shape was hidden from her, and she deserved to have it visible. What Irina and Baird have put forward tonight will travel to the people it needs to reach. That's already moving. I had no role in engineering what follows. I didn't set anything in motion. The figures Baird surfaced existed before we sat down tonight. The signatures Irina identified were falsified before any of us walked through that door. I made 2 phone calls. The rest of it was already true. I looked across to Fletcher. The distinction between what I did and what you did, I said, comes down to one thing. What I did required the truth to already be there. What you did required it to stay buried. Fletcher's jaw drew tight. His mouth opened, found nothing, and closed again. From her side of the room, Sasha reached over and lifted the bound report from where Irina had left it, took it in both hands and began to read. The room went quiet around her. Nobody spoke. We sat and waited. All of us waited for my daughter to move through the documented truth of what her own life had contained. That silence while Sasha read is what I'll keep from that room. Not the documents, not the figures, not what Fletcher's face looked like in that moment. What stays with me is the quality of that quiet my daughter on the sofa, turning every page. It wasn't the silence of courtesy people keeping still out of good manners. It was the silence of witnesses who understood they were present at the threshold of something that belonged entirely to her. That until she spoke nothing, anyone else might say would carry any weight at all. She moved through it slowly. Each page turned deliberately. It recalled the way she read as a little girl, one finger trailing just below the words, her whole face drawn inward and composed. Years had gone by without that memory surfacing. It found me now, the way certain things do, only once you've gone still enough for them to catch up. Sasha closed the report and rested it on the cushion beside her. Gently, without ceremony, the same unhurried care Irina had shown when she first laid it there. Between those two gestures, something had crossed the room. Sasha had taken in more than figures on a page. She sat a moment, hands resting in her lap. When she looked up, her eyes went to Fletcher. He was watching her with the concentrated stillness of a man who has spent all his options and is now studying the board, trying to determine whether to fold or overturn everything. Jaw set. Fingers laced. Whatever composure remained was still technically present, though. It had thinned the way ice thins in late February, still covering the surface, still presenting itself, but not something a sensible person would stand on any longer. "Did you forge my signature?" Sasha asked. No preamble, no climb in the voice, the kind of question you ask when you already know the shape of the answer, but need it witnessed spoken into the open air. Fletcher returned nothing. "Did you take money from the account my mother left me?" Her voice stayed level, didn't rise, didn't crack. It moved across that room with a flatness that was costing her something real to sustain. I could read it in her shoulders, the effort of keeping them back, the work of holding every expression in her face to a controlled stillness. Without telling me, without asking me. Fletcher's gaze went to the floor. 31 years spent in rooms where debts of words go unpaid gave me the grammar for that gesture. When a man looks at the floor while a direct question hangs in the air, the floor has become his answer. He's said everything through that avoidance. Sasha gave one slow nod. The nod of someone who has finished her arithmetic. She rose from the sofa. Not a dramatic rising, no tears, no unraveling, none of the emotional theater that movies have trained us to anticipate from a woman arriving at her limit. Her body simply reached a decision and acted on it. Deliberate, unhurried, done. She looked at me. I stood up alongside her. "Dad," she said quietly, "I want to go." I nodded. Into my jacket pocket went my hand and I drew out a small square of folded paper, written on an hour earlier, while I stood by myself in the snow at the side of the house. I'd torn it from the notepad I carry in the car, a habit from 30 years of always having something to write on. I held it out toward her. She took it, unfolded it, and read what was there. It said, "You do not have to decide anything tonight except whether to walk out this door. Everything else can wait. I have you." Her throat moved. She folded the note back along its original lines, tucked it into the pocket of her dress, drew her shoulders back, and looked at Fletcher one final time. "I'm going with my father tonight," she said. "I'll be in touch with you through Irina." "Sasha!" The word came apart in Fletcher's mouth, her name cracking open the surface of the composure he'd been working to sustain all night. What escaped through that seam may have been the real thing, the sound a man makes when he finally grasps the full mass of what he's demolished. "Please, we can talk about this. You don't have to—" "I do," said plainly. No edge underneath it, no performance layered on top, no desire to expand on it. 2 words, 2 years of weight behind them. She turned for the door. I moved with her. Denton stepped back to clear the way. Irina fell in behind us without a word. In the front hallway, Sasha stopped at the wall hook and lifted down her coat, the one she'd hung there herself when she arrived at her own house, and pulled it on at her own pace, starting at the bottom and working each button upward. From somewhere back in the room, I heard Harwick's voice. I didn't turn around to find out what he was saying. Fletcher called her name once more from the living room, softer now, less authority in it, the certainty having left. Sasha opened the front door. December came in with it, the same clean cold I'd stood in an hour ago on this same step, and she walked out into it without breaking stride. I went after her. Behind us, the door pulled shut on the candlelight and the warmth and the faultless Christmas tree and every carefully assembled thing inside that house that had been constructed to look like something other than what it was. 12 cars still lined the drive. The people standing near them straightened as we came down the steps, a small collective drawing up, the unspoken recognition of those who have been waiting, and understand, by the way, 2 people walk that the waiting is over. Irina joined us on the front step. "Before midnight, I'll have an emergency protective order filed," she said, her voice low. "That requires Fletcher to leave the marital residence within a defined window while proceedings begin. He has no grounds to push you out of your own home, Sasha. The two of you hold that property jointly until a court decides differently, and he'll be the one who goes." Sasha listened to all of it. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. Irina briefly touched her arm and moved off to place a call. I stood there looking at my daughter. Snow on the ground, 12 dark cars surrounding her, a Friday night in December. Coat buttoned to the throat, breath coming in small, pale clouds in the cold air. She looked like herself, in a way she hadn't all evening, in a way she perhaps hadn't for much longer than that. "Ready," I said. "Yes," she said. We walked to the car. The 2003 Mercury Grand Marquis carried the smell of motor oil and the pine air freshener I'd had on the mirror since October. When Sasha climbed in and drew the door shut, she went still for a beat, just breathing, hands in her lap, eyes on the windshield ahead. I'd expected the crying to arrive now in the privacy of the car with no one left to hold herself together for. It didn't come. What came instead was a long, slow exhale, the deliberate kind, the kind that releases whatever structure had been keeping a person upright. Then she glanced at the dashboard. "Dad, this car is really old." I turned the key. "It runs, the heater works. Give it a minute." She drew her coat closer and watched through the glass as I backed down the driveway, easing past the last two Rolls-Royces still angled along the curve, their dark panels picking up the glow of the fairy light strung through the birch trees one final time. In the rearview mirror, the house diminished lit windows, stone front, the whole composed face of the place, shrinking until the road curved and it vanished entirely. I let it go without watching. I'd had my fill of it. We drove without talking for several minutes. The heat came on gradually, the way that old Grand Marquis always warmed, building toward it, honestly, rather than claiming it before it was real. I'd always thought there was something right about that. The streets of the neighborhood gave way to the county roads I favored, heading home, less traffic, wider sky. The sort of stretch where a thought can run to its own conclusion, if the thought is worth anything. Sasha spoke first. "How long have you known?" Her tone was even genuinely curious, not pointed. The question of someone seeking information, not preparing a case. "Known which part exactly?" I said, deliberately. I let it sit for a moment, the way a real answer requires. I wasn't going to offer her something softened. She'd just come from hours surrounded by soft-looking things that were rotten underneath. She was owed the other variety now, the kind with weight to it. "The first time you rang me from his phone rather than your own," I said, "that was about 14 months ago. You said yours was charging. I took it at face value. By the third time it happened, I didn't anymore." She was quiet with that for a moment. "I didn't figure you'd pick up on something like that." "I pick up on everything," I said. "I just don't always make it known." She turned toward me in the darkened car. My daughter, 34 years old, riding passenger in a vehicle older than her last, apartment coat, buttoned hands in her lap, her face moving through the rhythm of passing street lamps in slow, measured intervals. I could sense her drawing toward something, the way you sometimes feel a conclusion taking shape before anyone has spoken it aloud, the distinct gravity of a person who has been circling something hard and is finally near enough to put a name to it. "I kept telling myself I could fix it," she said, "that if I were better at being what he needed, things would come around, that the version of our life he put online was the true one, and I just wasn't working hard enough to inhabit it. I know, honey. I know I gave up my job, Dad." Her voice held the weight of what that had meant. "I gave up my clients of people who had trusted me, people I'd spent 3 years earning one at a time, the way you always showed me carefully with care for doing it right." The words pulled taut toward the end, the specific grief of someone who followed the right principles and still ended up somewhere wrong. "I gave up my office on Asylum Street, the one with the big windows facing east where the light came in all morning." Her voice caught on that image. The windows, the morning light, the particular texture of something surrendered that can't be recovered in its original shape, only grown back slowly in a new form. "I thought it was my choice," she said. "I thought I was the one deciding." I drove without answering for a stretch. The headlights threw their particular yellow-white across the road, ahead old halogens I'd never replaced, because they worked, and I've never seen the logic in replacing things that work. Some people upgrade for the pleasure of novelty. I never understood that inclination. Your mother used to say, I said that the most dangerous thing another person can do to you is make you believe their idea was yours from the beginning. Sasha was quiet in the seat beside me, listening. That she said it about a contractor we'd hired, who talked me into a porch railing I never wanted, I said. But she meant it as a larger principle. She meant it about all the ways a person can be slowly turned away from themselves, degree by degree, until they look back and can no longer locate where they started. A small sound came from the passenger seat. It took me a moment to place it because I hadn't heard it in 2 years. A laugh brief startled escaping before she'd thought to let it, the kind that's honest for exactly that reason, because it arrived without permission. "A contractor," she said. "He wanted a railing I thought was hideous. Somehow I ended up going along with it. I still can't trace exactly how." Marin never let me live it down. Was the railing ugly dark brown iron completely wrong for the house? Is it still there? "I painted it white 3 months after she passed," I said. 4 hours of work. It was the first thing I changed. She went quiet for a moment. Then she laughed again longer, fuller not really about the railing at all, but about something underneath it. The quiet comedy of stubborn men and the women who outlasted every last bit of that stubbornness. And it was her real laugh, the one I remembered coming from the next room when she was on the phone, or when something on television caught her off guard. The laugh that Marin used to describe from the kitchen as sounding like a sports arena during a game. That laugh came back into the car as though it had never truly gone anywhere, as though it belonged to this family and had simply been elsewhere for a while. It filled the old car pressed up against the windows, and I kept my eyes on the road and let it run, because nothing I might have said could have matched the worth of hearing it. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. Arena Voss. I passed it to Sasha without glancing over. She read the message and her laughter eased into something quieter, not sadder, just steadier. The way a fire settles once the kindling has burned off, and what remains is a more reliable heat. "EPO granted," she said. "He has until 8 a.m. tomorrow to leave." Good, I said. She set the phone back and looked up at the sky, which had opened out now that we were on the county road, the clouds separating enough to show a scatter of stars, and the pale arc of a half-moon riding low above the tree line. "Dad," she said. Then after a pause, "Those people tonight, in the cars." She was working out how to frame it. "You really helped all 12 of them, over time." "Nothing deliberate about it," I said. "You show up when someone has need of you. You put your name behind things when your name means something. You answer the phone at inconvenient hours. You write the check when writing it is plainly the right thing to do. It accumulates," I said. "You don't feel it piling up. And then, one December night, you make a single call and 12 people start their engines." She turned that over in silence for a stretch, her face tilted slightly toward the window, the half-moon keeping pace with us through the trees. "I want to be that," she said finally. "I want to be the kind of person who builds something like that. Bonds that actually hold. People who show up because of who you are, not what you have." "You will be," I said. "You've already started. You just couldn't see it from inside that house." She let her head fall back against the headrest and closed her eyes. And the tension I'd been watching all evening in her shoulders, her jaw, her hands, it released. Slowly then, completely. The way a fist opens when there's nothing left worth holding on to. Through the windshield, the first familiar landmarks of Simsbury were coming into sight, the water tower catching the moonlight, the white church steeple against the dark tree line, the scattered warm glow of Route 10 up ahead, telling me we were nearly home. "That," she said softly almost to herself, eyes still closed. "You have 12 Rolls-Royces worth of friends, and you drive this car." "The Grand Marquis works," I said. "It really is ugly, though." "It is," I agreed entirely. She smiled without opening her eyes. She was still smiling when we turned onto Copperleaf Road and the porch light was burning the way it always is when I go out at night, because a house should look as though it's expecting you back. This one did. And we were home. The next morning I made coffee at 6 and sat at the kitchen table in the particular silence of a house with someone sleeping in the guest room for the first time in 4 years. A silence different from the silence of an empty house, heavier and warmer at once. Sasha slept until 9:30. I knew the exact moment she came up from it, the small sounds a person makes while finding their bearings in an unfamiliar room, the creak of the guest bed, water in the hallway bathroom, the specific stillness of someone standing at a window before they were ready to meet the morning. I poured a second cup and left it on the counter where she'd find it. Then I went out to the garage and returned to work on the carburetor I'd set aside 3 days before. At 9:52 she appeared in the doorway, wearing Marin's old cardigan. She must have found it in the closet, holding the coffee in both hands. Hair not yet sorted, eyes clear. Irina called. I heard the phone. She said, "Fletcher left the house at 7:40. EPO is in effect." She looked at the carburetor on the workbench. "What are you doing?" "Fixing something," I said. She nodded as though that were answer enough. In this house, it always had been. She pulled a stool to the edge of the workbench, sat down and drank her coffee while she watched me work. We didn't need to say much more about the night before. Not yet. Some things require a little distance before the right words find them. What unfolded over the 9 months that followed was not dramatic in the way that evening had been dramatic. It was the slower, more grinding work of institutions doing exactly what they're built to do when the evidence is solid and the purpose is clear. January brought the EPO hearing. Fletcher's attorney argued the order was disproportionate and sought modification. The judge reviewed Irina's documentation, the forged signature analysis, the unauthorized collateral pledge, the home equity draws, and the medical report from Hartford Hospital recording Sasha's shoulder injury from the night of December 20th, and denied the modification in 11 minutes. Fletcher was required to maintain his distance from the marital residence and from Sasha. He complied, which surprised me less than it might have, because men who keep control through indirection rarely have much stomach for open confrontation once the indirection has been stripped from them. February brought the formal referral. Irina filed with the Connecticut State's Attorney's Office. Baird Fenwick submitted his financial analysis to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, citing potential violations of 18 U.S.C. 1343. The federal dimension complicated matters for Fletcher considerably. State charges can sometimes be steered by attorneys who know the local terrain, but federal charges carry a different ceiling, a different gravity, and Fletcher's lawyers understood that distinction perfectly well. March arrived with the divorce proceedings behind it. Sasha had gone back to the marital residence once the EPO cleared the way her right, and she exercised it, because as she told me from that kitchen over the phone, the house had stopped belonging to him the evening she walked out and resumed belonging to her the moment she stepped back through the door. Fletcher's legal team didn't concede quietly. Counter motions got filed, depositions were sought, and attorneys did what attorneys do when the meter is running and the client won't acknowledge what the numbers say. It cost him more than the situation required, more time than he had to spare. April came in with the subcontractors. 11 of them, spread across 3 Morrow construction jobs, brought civil actions for unpaid labor, totaling $840,000. No coordination among them. Each suit arrived independently, each one standing for a small operator who'd done the work, gone without payment, and finally run out of goodwill. Harwick Morrow turned up in 2 of those filings as a personal guarantor on project contracts. His own exposure was no longer a matter of speculation. Harwick rang me in May. He wanted to know whether we could speak off the record. I told him I couldn't see what it would accomplish. He said he needed to explain his side of things. I said his conduct at the dinner table on the 20th of December had done that already plainly enough. He brought up his family. I said I understood, and that his family was precisely part of why I wouldn't be taking his call. He didn't try again. June delivered the business closure. Morrow Construction Group went into Chapter 7 liquidation, not reorganization, which told you everything about what was left to work with. 41 workers lost their livelihoods. I came across the story in the Hartford Courant on a Thursday morning, coffee in hand, and felt what I've always felt when something long in motion finally arrives at its end. Not gratification and nothing close to pleasure. Just that worn-down relief of a sound that's been running in the background for too long, falling finally silent. September brought the outcome. Fletcher reached a plea agreement with the federal prosecutor's office wire, fraud 1 count anchored to the fabricated financial statements he'd submitted to Berkshire Summit Capital Partners. The deal carried a 3-year sentence with supervised release to follow. His counsel had negotiated it below an original exposure that Baird described to me on a Tuesday phone call as substantially higher. Harwick settled separately on the guarantor fraud, counts a sizable fine, and 2 years of probation. Lighter than what the facts warranted, heavier than anything he'd thought he was facing back in January. October delivered the divorce decree. Sasha walked away with the marital residence, her inheritance account made whole with interest, and a structured settlement that Irina described over the phone as appropriate to the circumstances, which in the language lawyers use means the opposing side did not come out ahead. Sasha wasn't especially focused on the figures. She had already put her name on a design contract with a Hartford hotel group. 2 properties exactly the caliber of work that had been available to her 4 years prior before she stepped back from her career to fill the shape someone else had drawn for her. She phoned the day the contract was signed. "Dad," she said, "I have big windows again." I was out in the garage when the call came. I set down what I'd been holding, settled onto the old stool, and let my daughter tell me about her windows. I thought about Marin, about 31 years of building things together, one December night, and the particular accounting of what a life surrenders and what it recovers. There wasn't much to say. "Good," I told her. "That's good, Sasha." She came for dinner that evening, brought her own groceries, took over the kitchen, and cooked, navigating the space the way someone does when they've long known where every drawer and cabinet sits. I watched her from the table. The house held a warmth that can only generate with two people moving around inside it. Beyond the window, the birch trees along Copperleaf Road had gone to gold in the fading afternoon. December came back without announcement, the way it does, draping itself over Connecticut like a coat worn soft through decades of use. On a Saturday afternoon, I was in the garage attending to the side door hinge that had been binding since August. A small, nagging problem of the kind a reasonably attentive person addresses immediately, and that I had been walking past for 4 months, while something else always claimed the time. A Hartford station played standards through the radio. The light slanting in through the garage window carried that particular December quality, low and gold and thin, the kind that makes every ordinary object look as if it were set down with intention. I caught the sound of Sasha's car in the driveway before she came into view. She'd picked up a used Honda CR-V in March, practical, sensible, the decision of a woman who had determined that what she chose would answer to what she genuinely needed, not to what read well from the street. Engine off, door, footsteps along the path. Then she was in the garage doorway the way she used to materialize in doorways as a girl, filling the space not through any physical size but through some quality of being that announces itself, the kind of presence that makes a room register its own character. She wore the good charcoal work coat she'd bought at the start of the hotel project bag on one shoulder, hair loose. She looked like herself, in precisely the way that takes years to recover after living so long inside another person's definition of you. "You're still going at that hinge," she said. "Working on it right now," I said. "You've been at it since August. Things move at their own pace." She came inside, dropped her bag on the workbench, and took in the garage the way she always does, the surveying instinct of a designer who never entirely stops reading a room. The previous spring, she'd reorganized the tool wall when she came out to help me hang new shelving. Her system was an improvement over the arrangement I'd been using for 12 years, which I'd acknowledged to her, and which she'd accepted with the low-key pleasure of someone who has spent her life seeing how things ought to be organized and is now finally unencumbered to act on it. "How's the Hartford job going?" I asked. "Well," she rested against the workbench, arms folded, the posture of someone who's arrived for a proper conversation, not a quick one. "We wrapped the east wing this week. The morning light in those rooms landed exactly where I wanted it. The contractor pushed back on the window positioning. I held my ground." "Good." He decided I was being unreasonable. "Were you—" "I was correct," she said. "From outside, those two things can look identical." I put the tool down and looked at her and heard Marin say nearly the same thing in this same room 20 years back. Different contractor, different window. The thread of it moved through me the way continuity does when you're 67 and have paid enough attention over enough years to see how one moment is stitched to another across decades. "Dad," Sasha said, "can I ask you something?" "Always." She was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting across the workbench, the ranked tools, the old Grand Marquis holding its spot with the composure of something that has earned its place through use rather than appearance. "Do you regret not acting sooner? Not saying something that first time you saw that things weren't right?" I held the question up properly before answering. "Every day," I said, "and also no." She looked at me. "Every day because you were suffering, and I could read it in pieces, and I kept reminding myself you were grown, and it wasn't my place to manage your life." I paused. "No, because if I had moved when I first began to see it, you would have pushed back. You would have defended him, defended the marriage, assembled every reason it was all right, because you were still standing inside it, and the shape of the thing wasn't visible from there." I lifted the tool and turned it in my hands. "Certain doors open only from the interior. I had no way to do it in your place. What I could do was stay close enough that when you were ready to reach for that door yourself, I was standing right there." Sasha sat quietly with that for a long time. Beyond the garage door, the light had changed that early December, surrender toward dark, the birch trees at the yard's edge going pewter in the fading afternoon. The radio was putting out something slow and half familiar, a song I couldn't put a name to, but recognized the way you recognize things that were playing during years you were paying close attention to. Yeah, Mom would have liked tonight, Sasha said, not a question. She would have made something complicated. I said, and made it look like nothing at all. Sasha smiled, and made you clean up after, every time. She pushed back from the workbench, crossed to the Grand Marquis, and pressed her palm flat against the hood. The gesture of someone acknowledging something faithful, not quite affection, something steadier than that. And still the ugliest car in the county, she said. Started this morning. That's not much of a standard. It's a consistent one. Low and consistent is more valuable than people give it credit for. She laughed and the sound went up into the rafters and bounced back down into the garage. I let it settle and fill the space before I offered anything else. Staying for dinner, I asked. I brought groceries, she said, reaching for the bag on the workbench. Soup, I found Mom's recipe, the one with the rosemary. I set down the hinge tool, switched off the lamp over the bench, and stood a moment in what light was left. I looked at the tools in their places, the old car, the door, with its hinge now swinging clean, the way it should have been swinging for months. And I thought about 31 years of building something. And one December evening, and all the ground between the man I had been in that boardroom on Asylum Street and the man standing here in this garage in Simsbury, Connecticut, with grease on his hands and his daughter heading inside to cook. The distance wasn't what I might have pictured. Shorter in some directions, longer in others, and mostly it was just the distance that accumulates when you do the work that's sitting in front of you. Pay attention to what matters. Be present when presence is what's called for. Let the rest find its own resting place. I followed Sasha inside. The kitchen was lit and warm, and she was already at the counter arranging things in the quiet, orderly way she has. The house carried its own sound, again occupied, purposeful, in a way it hadn't for years. Through the kitchen window, the first snow of December was coming down in small, unhurried flakes. I took my time washing my hands at the sink. It smells good already, I said. I haven't started yet, she said. That's where this story ends. Not with noise and not with a scene. With a woman at a kitchen counter, a pot on the stove, and a house that finally sounded like itself again. This one cost something to tell. It cost something to live to 2 years of watching from a careful distance, moving only when the ground was solid enough to move on. I believe God has a sense of timing that we rarely understand until we're standing on the other side of it. Warren didn't act out of anger. He acted out of love, and he waited until love could actually do something useful. That patience is what made the difference between a confrontation and a reckoning. If you're someone in the adult's 50-plus season of life, you know what it means to carry something heavy, quietly. You know the weight of watching someone you raised walk into a life that's slowly diminishing them? This family revenge story isn't about revenge in the way films tend to mean it. It's about truth, and truth when it's handled carefully doesn't destroy it, restores. Here is what I'd carry from this story. First, the most powerful thing you can do for someone trapped is stay close, stay quiet, and stay ready. Second, when you build real relationships over decades, you build something that can actually show up when it counts. Third, if someone is working against the person you love, gather what's true before you move, then move completely. Fourth, some doors open only from the inside. Your job is to be standing there when the person you love finally reaches for the handle. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. I read them. Share it with someone who might need it right now. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for being here tonight. Take good care of each other.